Good morning, David. We just want to welcome you to Ministry with Coffee. How are you today?
We're doing good. It's a beautiful fall day outside. The trees are doing exactly what God designed them to do. So we're doing pretty good right now.
Awesome. So we know that you're in politics, correct?
That is correct. I'm in the Oklahoma Senate. I'm in Senate District 6. So in Oklahoma, we serve 4-year terms in the Senate, and we have districts. So there's 48 different senators in Oklahoma. I'm in District 6, which is kind of southeast, south central Oklahoma.
Oh, that's so good. So, okay, I know personally that you are not always in this as a senator or in the Senate. So, what did you do before, and what made you decide to change and run for office?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I had zero desire to be in politics, none. I always liked studying and listening and reading up, and I paid attention to all the elections. Even when I was younger, I liked history. I loved reading history. I read every Louis L'Amour book I could get my hand on, and I love those kinds of things. So I kind of grew up liking that aspect of it. And of course, my dad quite well. He's a pilot, and I thought I was going to be a pilot until one day one of the instructors did a roll with me in an airplane. And I was up right side up for about 10 minutes and couldn't figure out if I was upside down still or right side up, and never stepped back into an airplane again for a long time. Now, of course, now I am. So the pilot thing didn't work out. And it was actually my mom who said, you love history. You're a history nerd. You read about it all the time. You read about the American Revolution and everything now. Why don't you go teach? You get to talk about it all the time. And that just really made sense to me. And Southeastern has a really good aviation school, and I was already accepted there. And you got to understand, if you back up just a little bit to kind of some of my background, I grew up in either a teaching family or a pilot, or farming or ranching, something like that. And so I was already going to Southeastern anyways. I was already going to be there. But I thought for flight school, and then it later switched over that I wanted to go to there to be a teacher. And so I grew up and on that education side of things, and I loved it. When I got in that classroom, it was me. I could tell God had a fit for me. That was exactly where God had intended me to be the whole time. And so I got into education and teaching, and this is what I was teaching. I taught AP US history, AP government, which are all the college level stuff. And I focused really heavily on the Constitution. But when I was in college, I was taught a false sense of what the country was, a complete lie of what our country is. And I'll be honest with you, I bought that lie very early on. And a lot of people who listen to your show probably have something really similar that when they hear this, because they'll say, oh, yeah, no, we were taught the Constitution's a secular document. It is not. They were taught that that most of the founders, you probably have heard this before, Tricia, that our founders were a bunch of secularists and deists and atheists. That is not true. 55 of the 56 signers were evangelical, strong Christians. Even someone who wasn't as probably religious as some of them, like Benjamin Franklin, still believed heavily in the Bible. But I was taught the other side of that. And so my first year in teaching, in middle school, I taught or tried to teach it just exactly like I was taught it in college. And it was more of an opinionated, telling a story kind of thing. And after my first year, I never will forget, I came up to my wife and said, who is dumb enough to do this twice? I'm going to go back into construction, or I'm going to go back in. I'm going to do something different. I can't do this. And they all talked me out of quitting. And they said, no, stay in it. You're doing okay. It's just, you have to tone it to who you are. And so I said, well, what I'm going to do is instead of trying to tell kids my opinion on history, like what I was taught in college, I'm just going to show history to them. I want them to see it, read it, touch it, feel it. I want them to understand history from a primary source level versus a secondary source level. And so I stumbled onto, and I don't believe in accidents, so stumbling onto, it's not a good word to use, but I found wallbuilders.com. And it's a guy named David Barton, who I have just immense respect for. and another guy named Bill Federer, who's the same way. Just both historians who actually don't just tell you their opinion. They show you a document, just like how I taught. They say, this is what the founders were talking about. And it just blew me away, the stuff I found about our Christian and constitutional heritage. I mean, just down to a point where it angered me. I went back to my professors and said, why did you lie to me? Because you didn't show me this. You purposefully omitted an awful lot of primary sources that you should have. Matter of fact, looking back, they never even showed me the Constitution. They just told me their opinion about it, and we took tests on it, you know. And so I vowed that I would change that from there on out. And so for the rest of my time teaching, that's what I did. I showed them the primary sources. I showed them what their founders actually said. And then I said, okay, let's talk about it. Let's discuss it. What does this mean? What was going on at the time? And then let's talk about what you think about it from that standpoint. But then, you know, we have to have a baseline of facts to understand our history. And if you deny and say we are a secular nation, you are not reading the founding documents, just flat out. If you're claiming that the founding fathers were atheist and deist, you have not bothered to go check what the founders actually wrote about and talked about. And David Barton analyzed, I think it's over 15,000 documents. And I believe it's 80% of the time they were quoting either William Blackstone, or they were quoting the Bible, or someone who was quoting the Bible specifically. Or they were quoting the person who was quoting the Bible. So the founders, in everything that they were doing, in every aspect, and it's all easy to document, because that's one of the greatest gifts the founders gave to us, was that documentation. And so it changed the way I taught. And it also changed my life in other ways, because the parents of these kids got mad at the way I was teaching it, and they wanted me to come in, and they would tell me, you're going to stop teaching this way. And I would tell them, I'm not changing anything. I will not teach a revisionist history anymore. I will show your kids history, but I will not sacrifice on that. And I had a very, very good principal at the high school, Dr. Bodiger, who I have a immense respect for. And he told me, he said, David, as long as you teach it this way, where you are showing them the documents and you're making them analyze those primary sources, and as long as it's not your opinion, you're teaching it as it is, man, knock it out of the park. Look at them. So that was really helpful to me, to just be able to keep expanding on that and showing the kids more about history. And then the other side of it is, most of those kids that I had at that top 10 were pretty liberal kids coming from pretty liberal families. And I spent most of my time just trying to argue with them about, you know, opposite points. And I would tell my kids, you may be able to argue the liberal point really well, but I can argue the conservative point just as well. But here's the other thing to my conservative kids. If you're trying to argue the conservative point, I'm going to argue the liberal point, because I want you to learn how to think. I want you to be exposed to different ideas. I want you to discuss and debate and learn civil discourse, which so many of our kids have lost today. And so in that, my pastor is a guy named Bill Ledbetter, and that's somebody you probably ought to have on. I mean, he's brilliant. And Bill has been the pastor of our church for 20 years. And Bill was the one who kind of guided me to Wall Builders and some of these other sources. Bill really encouraged me to speak truth no matter what. And then I never will forget, because I was very kind of introverted kid. I wasn't very socially out there. I was quiet. I didn't really want to talk to people. At my own wedding, I was begging my wife to let's elope, because I don't want to stand in front of that many people. And, you know, it was just made me a nervous wreck just to stand in front of people like that. So speaking, getting out in public like that is just not really my thing. And
Look at you.
do what? You're
And
right
now
there with
look
me.
at you.
But yeah, now look at me. Yeah, they're, you know, that's what teaching did. And I've looked back on my life and figured out, you know, maybe God that whole time in education was just teaching me for the next step, what he wanted me to do. And it was, because I got comfortable talking in front of people. I got comfortable talking to people about very, very controversial issues. I had to be able to talk to kids that were pro-choice in a public school about pro-life issues, because I knew they were going to argue the pro-choice issue. So I had to know my pro-life issues to be able to argue back. So it really got me proficient in being able to talk to people without slamming them on the ground, and be able to explain and ask enough questions to get to where you were. So there was a lot of training going on there by the Lord on what it is that he wanted me to do. And then, so I did that for 15 years, just back and forth. And I remember Bill Ledbetter, my pastors, had been preaching a whole series of sermons on, he called it Carry Your Cross. It was a 2-month long series, maybe longer, on carrying your cross. And I told him, I said, man, why are you guilt tripping me like this? And he said, what are you talking about? And he said, if the Lord's talking to you, maybe you need to listen. And I remember I surrendered one time, and at a certain point where I'd had enough, where I said, Lord, if you want me to get involved, and I was very well read, very well versed. I knew how to talk to people. I knew how to make the arguments. And I said, if you want me to get involved, I will. And I even went to the front, prayed that through, and I surrendered to that. And I said, Lord, if you want me to do this, it's fine. I'll get involved in Bill's ministry. His ministry at the time was called Patriot Ministry. We've changed it since then to be called Lighthouse, which I'm on the board of now. And our goal is to teach our Christian and constitutional heritage to a generation that was taught something totally different. And
it with your generation.
Well, and it just keeps growing. That's the problem with sin. Sin never shrinks. You either have to wipe sin off the board completely, but if you ever let any part of sin be part of you, it will consume you. Mm-hmm. And it's the same way in this. As our country moves further from God, you will see things all the way around, the economy, everything else, worsen and worsen and worsen until we finally have something that wipes it off the books and we go back to the covenant we made.
It's seeds. Whatever we plant, it's going to grow.
That's right. Yeah.
Whether you plant good seed or bad seed, it's going to grow, and it's going to have a harvest of some kind. Yep. So that's what you're talking about.
No, it really is. And so I surrendered that morning, but I remember asking the Lord very specifically, Lord, I'll surrender and I'll help the ministry, but whatever you do, don't make me speak in front of people. I hate talking in front of people. That's all I'm asking. Please, Lord, don't do that. And I thought I heard a laugh. I don't know if it was him or somebody in the congregation.
Laughing.
Yeah, somebody laughed. And so that next week, Bill Ledbetter called me and said, brother, would you be willing to come MC our next conference? And I said, oh, okay, you're obviously not going to let me out of this one. And I said, that's fine. I'll do it. How many people are we going to be in front of? 25, 30. And he said, probably right around 3,000 is what we're estimating will be there. And I said, okay. So I figured I might as well get used to doing that and getting into it. And he has. I mean, the Lord, every time I've gotten up to speak, gives me a peace and a clarity on what he wants me to say. He's given me the message that I need to talk about and how to get that message across to people, where I'm not just blowing them up. I'm not here to just destroy your life. I'm here to expose you to a different way of thinking. And it's the way God anticipates and interprets what politics is. Because I do not believe that there is a single corner of this world God cannot occupy and will not work in. And so when we have any place that we abandon in this country, I give this speech a lot. It's called the vacuum left. Anytime we abandon any aspect of our country, the devil's going to occupy it. It's an automatic occupation of the devil. And so, you've heard about this movement called Occupy Wall Street, where the liberals want to make everybody else give them their money so that they can have more of it without working, kind of concept, which is incredibly unbiblical. When we get to this point, we have to be almost an occupy the world concept. And if you remember, what was Jesus's last instructions to his disciples? Go into the world, teaching everything that I have taught you. That means the entire counsel of God's word, not just what you want to teach. The country, and let's back all the way back up to the foundations. At the founding of our country, the country was 98.2% evangelical Christian. Different sects and denominations, but 98.2% of the country were evangelical Christians. And your pastors were known as the Black Robe Regiment, right? You've heard those presentations on who they were. And those are the people who stood up and said, what's happening with a king is unbiblical. And they went back to Isaiah 33:22, where it says that the Lord is our king, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king, the Lord is our judge. And you can hear within that, when the founders were talking about that, those are the three branches of government. And so when they got away from a monarchy, why did they get away from a monarchy? Because it's unbiblical. Why did they go to free markets? We'll go back and reread Jesus's telling of the tenants and the minas, where he gave 1 to one, 2 to another, and 5 to another. The one that got 1 and the one that got 2 went and buried it and hoarded it and didn't invest it, and it went crazy. And he scolded them and took everything away from them. And the one that he gave 5 to went and invested it and made more money and multiplied it and gave it back to his master. And he said, well done. That's a free market system. That's a biblical system of an economy. And so all of these things, when you look at how the founders did it, and if you even go back to their words, and I'll give you a quote or two from that, but Noah Webster, most people don't even know who he is. Webster's dictionary, right?
Right.
Noah Webster, founder, one of the founding generations, signer of the Declaration of Independence. He worked at the Constitutional Convention. Noah Webster said that a brief exposition of the Constitution will unfold to young people the genuine source of correct Republican principles, not the party. We're a republic, not a democracy. And he said it is the sincere desire of this writer that our citizens should early understand that the genuine source of correct Republican principles is the Bible, or specifically the New Testament of the Christian religion. John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, said that providence, they use that to understand who Almighty God is. Providence has given to our country the right to pick and choose our rulers, and it is the right and responsibility of this Christian nation to select and prefer Christians as our leaders. That's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who said that. So for all those people saying, oh, separation of church and state means that Christians have to stay out of politics. No. The separation of church and state says the government has to stay out of Christians. Christians can get involved all they want. And in fact, Christians are the reason it's here. Everything is based upon those things. The Supreme Court once ruled in one of their court cases very early on, and they said our laws are based upon the 10 Commandments and the teachings of Jesus. That doesn't sound like a separate church.
Yeah, and let's talk about that, because I think a lot of people have this misunderstanding about going into ministry. Ministry is wherever God sends you.
That's right.
And I think a lot of people are confused about that. I remember early on when I just had this incredible experience with the Lord myself, and it was about 22 years ago, and I wanted to get into ministry. And I applied for a church, and then I found out how much they were going to pay me. I'm not getting into ministry. Because I couldn't support a family on that. But I do remember in that quiet moment that God said, Trisha, you're already doing ministry. You're doing ministry right where you're at.
Yep.
As an HR person, which is a human resource director, I was able to love on people. I was able to speak life into people and to pray for people right there in my office. No one ever stopped me from praying over an individual in my office.
Yep.
And I had that freedom, and I was able to be a witness in the work environment like you're doing right now in politics. You're being the light of Christ in politics. We can be a light of Christ wherever we are. And I think that that's what's happened, is that everyone just assumes we have to do this in the church. Well, we are the church. God is calling us all to go into these workplaces, into the schools like you're talking about. Yeah, if you're a teacher and you're a Christian and you're retired and we know there's a shortage, go back. Go give it a couple of years. Go speak life into those children. Go take God back to the school. Stand up where we need you to stand up. So I think we as a body of Christ need to stand up and do what God is truly calling us to do, which is not only take our country back, but take every area of our country back.
Yeah, I remember I think it was the book of John where Jesus said, and when you retire, you don't have to do my work anymore.
No.
Well, no, maybe I'm not thinking of that right. I don't think he ever said that.
No.
When we retire, as a matter of fact, we have a responsibility to mentor younger Christians.
Mm-hmm.
That concept of making disciples out of disciples.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the job. And if it means getting back into your public schools and teaching for a few years to get on from there, or maybe it means that you need to get on with your to go mentor other teachers, or we have a ministry in Durant where they're not going in to teach, but what they're doing is they just minister to the teachers at that school. So our church has they call it adopt a school, right? So set it up so that your church brings snacks and food to your teachers, and they come in and help counsel kids. And they come in Oklahoma, we did what's called a pull-out time, where they can the churches can actually go pull the kids out of their schools and read the Bible as part of a reader, and help them learn how to read on those kinds of things. Very few churches are taking advantage of it. We're trying to get churches to understand, man, here's your shot.
So before we leave today, and I'm so glad that you came on, what an incredible message that you shared today. It's going to speak to a lot of people on different levels, so many different levels. So before we close, is there a final word you want to give to the listeners to kind of bring them hope of what you have seen that's going well in the government?
I'm seeing a movement right now with all kinds of possibilities. And again, I'll go back to Charlie Kirk. Charlie had tapped into something that that we need to pay attention to, and it's that Gen Z, the generation that's going to be taking care of you and me when we're in depends and diapers in a nursing home. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I hope not. That Gen Z is desperate for a savior, and they're willing to engage. Millennials would not engage and talk to us about any of these issues. They wanted to shut us out. Gen Z is saying, okay, come talk to me. Now they're skeptical because they've been taught something really weird, and this is all new stuff to them. To a boomer or to an old time, the greatest generation, they had heard and been in church. Most everybody went to church. Reading the Bible and praying was still in school. To this generation, you have to understand where they are. Most of them have never stepped foot in a church. They have never read a Bible, but they're willing to talk to you about it. Now that's a big deal. And so if we will engage this generation with truth from the Bible about a man named Jesus, who is God's son, who died on a cross, rose in 3 days, and did that all for you. He did not do that for his own notoriety. He did that so you have a way to get to God and get to heaven. They're open to that discussion. And I think you're going to see politics shift if we as Christians will engage that culture and get them to understand that even God is even in politics. You don't have to sit there in a pew like a church mouse. God designed some people to go into politics and to use his biblical word to change the circumstances around them. And so we have to engage this generation coming up and start talking to them about why God is so great. Yep. Yeah, very
So I
good.
want to thank you for coming on the show, and I want to thank you for sharing. And I think it's going to make a huge difference. So really, I appreciate your time and your effort. We love what you're doing for Oklahoma. Of course, if you came back to your birth state, Texas, we'd be even happier because we'd love to have you here too. But we know that's not going to happen. We've already tried that before.
No.
But thanks for coming on. All right.
All right. Thank you, sis. Thank you for what you're doing in that ministry. You're making a massive difference. So we love you and appreciate you.
Hello, friends. I just want to take a moment and thank you for joining us today with Ministry with Coffee. We're so glad that you're here. And I want to ask that if this has moved you or encouraged you, the story that you just listened to today, that you would like our page and that you would share our page with your friends and your family. Together, if we work together, we can share the gospel of Jesus throughout the world at one cup, one story at a time. Thank you again for your support. We are so glad that you have chosen to minister and partner with us. Thank you again.